Hello everyone, this is Dalster and welcome to another episode review of Dark Side of the Ring, Season 1, Episode 2. And in this episode, it talks about the controversial Montreal screwjob. In case you guys don't know what that is, it's an incident that happened in Montreal, Canada, where Bret was told that he would get the WWE title, but Vince McMahon had the referee make Shawn Michaels win the title instead. This caused Bret to be very furious and angry with Vince, that he spit on him and held a grudge for valid reasons towards Vince for many years. It was and still is controversial, as Vince and Bret said that it was not their own fault, but the other person. We also get a glimpse of the referee who was a part of that match, where he explains how it was and how it made him feel. Before we get to the Montreal screwjob, let's focus a little on the Hart family first, and how important they are in the wrestling industry. Stu Hart, Bret's father, was the patriarch of the Hart family and a veteran. He had a dungeon in the basement of his house, where he had football players and bodybuilders train, but they also got tortured. The Hart family also had a wrestling bear, and people would come over to eat breakfast at the Hart house. Stu also had a wrestling promotion called Stampede Wrestling Promotion in Alberta, Canada. In 1984, Vince bought Stampede Wrestling and took its biggest stars, Bret Hart and Jimmy Neidhart. In the 80s, supposedly Ric Flair was having health issues while he was champ, so they had to change the champion image since Flair had to take care of himself. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels would eventually take the champion image. The way the WWF, now WWE, works is that if a wrestler gets lots of popularity and sells lots of merch, they are the ones that get titles. Bruce Pritchard explains that a wrestler has the championship in a scripted storyline. Jim Cornette compared Vince McMahon to P.T. Barnum, a very big businessman back in the day and a showman in the old days of the 1800s, and Donald Trump when it comes to business and making money. Then WCW came along and took some of WWF's stars, such as Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Scott Hall, Razor Ramon, and Ted DiBiase. WCW was a big threat for WWF in the 90s, and for them to take some of their talent must be excruciating, especially friendships within the locker room. The Clique were one of the first people to break character and end kayfabe, as Scott and Kevin said goodbye because they were going to WCW. Scott and Kevin hugged Triple H and Shawn Michaels after their last match. Kayfabe is the portrayal of staged events within the industry, as real or true friendships between participants are being genuine and not staged or written in the script. Bret and Shawn, however, had an interesting, unique wrestling relationship that the audience got invested in. Eric Bischoff offered Bret a $2 million contract in order for him to join WCW, but Bret refused as he wanted to be loyal to the WWF. During the last years in the WWF for Bret, Shawn started being very cocky, and it did not help Bret as he was on edge with working for WWF. Bret did not like Shawn's behavior and that he was posing for Playgirl because he felt that wrestlers should be an influence, not be a poser. Before talking about Shawn being in the Playgirl magazine, he asked Shawn if he could do a promo to the audience about it. Bret said that Shawn said yes, so he bashed Shawn about the magazine in a promo. Once Bret was done, he said that Shawn was crushed and cried about Bret talking about the magazine. Shawn then did his own promo later on and made references to Sunny Days, as he thought that Bret was having an affair with Sunny. He then said that Bret could not get the job done, as Shawn also slept with Sunny, who was a valet in WWF and WCW in the 90s. Bret unfortunately had to explain to his wife once he got home that it was just a storyline because he did not really have an affair with Sunny. After he cut the promo, Bret did not talk to Shawn for months. Things got heated, as one day Shawn abruptly comes into Bret's dressing room and starts a fight. Bret thought that he and Shawn were fighting like two prostitutes downtown. After the fight, Shawn goes to the boss's room with some of his hair torn off and said that the work environment was unsafe. Unfortunately for Vince, in the 90s, WWF was losing ratings, so he had to make some cuts. Vince told Bret that he could not afford him, so he told Bret that he had to cut him off. Bret was heartbroken, so he signed the WCW contract after being told that he was getting cut off. Since Bret was champion, he was supposed to drop the belt at Survivor Series and then walk freely, since that's what the WWF management would want if a champion was leaving the company. For Bret, he did not want to, as he wanted to leave with the belt. Promoters thought Bret was going to drop the belt eventually, but then Bret decided not to after an altercation with Shawn. What happened was that Bret told Shawn that he was going to drop the belt to him and to not worry about the match, as Bret will make it safe for Shawn. Shawn, however, tells Bret that he won't do the same thing for Bret, and goes to the dressing room and slams the door. From there, Bret decided that he did not want to lose his title to Shawn because he was being rude and that Shawn did not deserve the belt. It's obvious by now that Bret and Shawn hated each other during this period. Jim Cornette agreed with Bret that Shawn did not deserve the belt for his rude behavior back in the day. Bret also began to have suspicions with the referee of their match and Vince as the day of the match was happening. Earl Hebner was the referee for Bret and Shawn's match at Survivor Series, and he also did some of Bret's matches. Around this time, Bret was filming a documentary called Wrestling with Shadows, where the film crew would follow Bret around. The crew had Bret wired so that he could be heard talking to Vince, as Bret didn't want to at first, but he eventually went with it. As the mic was wired and Bret talked to Vince, you can hear Bret telling Vince that he wanted to win the match, drop the belt, and give a speech the next night, as Vince told him that he was open to ideas. Bruce said that he wanted British Bulldog and Owen Hart to run out of the ring so that the match would end in a no contest. Bret decided to put his guard down and trusted Earl, which he said in this episode that it was a mistake to not worry about the match. Jerry Briscoe allegedly told Earl to ring the bell after Bret did a sharpshooter. Earl felt that it was not the right thing to do. Before the match, Bret and Shawn brawled for 10 minutes, and soon after brawling, the match began. Shawn tries to do Bret's sharpshooter, but messes up. Bret said he saw Vince with a cold look and sees Vince telling Earl to ring the bell. Bret reverses Shawn's sharpshooter, but Earl ends up ringing the bell. After ringing the bell, Earl runs off to his car and drives off in fear. Meanwhile, Bret gets furious with Vince, as he feels betrayed. Bret then wrote the letters WCW with his fingers in front of the audience and then spits at Vince. As he gets out of the ring, Bret wrecks everything on his way out, as the stuff costed about $100,000. Vince Russo said in the episode that he was the one that wrote the script on how Bret and Shawn's match was going to be. Russo said that Vince McMahon had a lot of ideas for Russo to write down, but the ideas would change many times. Not surprised if you know what I mean. Vince McMahon had Russo work with Jim Cornette, and the two of them, of course, hated each other and would argue over the ideas. Jim said that history has a way of repeating itself, as he explains in this episode of another screwjob from a long time ago. Russo, however, denies or hardly remembers Jim telling McMahon of the double-cross scenario. Jim said that he was telling the truth and that he did tell McMahon of the screwjob from before. But for Russo, it was one of the worst nights working with Jim. Bruce said that he was not involved with the Montreal screwjob, as he felt betrayed for some odd reason. Shawn, however, tells Bret that he was not a part of Vince's plan when he went to Bret's dressing room. Everyone interviewed for this episode believed that Shawn was in on it, though. As Bret came out of the shower after the incident, he sees Vince McMahon and goes back to the shower, taking his sweet time, as Vince waited a long time. Vince tells Bret that this was the first time that he lied to one of his talents, but Bret was not having it. As he tied his shoes while naked, Bret says 14 years in his mouth and punches Vince with an uppercut, leaving Vince to fall on the ground cold. Bret said that Shawn was crying like a baby as chaos erupted backstage. Afterwards, Bret went over to Shawn and tapped Shawn on the shoulder to thank him for the match, even though he knew that Shawn was in on it. Eric said that he remembered the day of the JFK assassination as well as the Montreal screwjob. Bret said that he loses sleep over that day, as he wished that he could have done something else to Shawn, probably just to beat him up, I would assume. Bret to this day has not changed his mind about Vince screwing him, and that what he said about the Montreal screwjob is true in his opinion. Russo said that McMahon was trying to protect the business. Afterwards, Bret exposed the business to the news about him being screwed by Vince. Vince, however, says that Bret screwed Bret, which to this day people still talk about the infamous line. Bruce said that Vince was cold that day after the screw job, as seen on an interview he had with Jim Ross. This incident reinvented Vince as the evil millionaire Mr. McMahon, a character that would be one of the biggest heels in wrestling. Bret came to WCW days after he got screwed in WWF, and Eric had him be a referee on his first day. Bret was not happy about this and was a great technical wrestler, but he had a really big ego. In the episode, Bret calls Eric an imbecile and says that he should not have run a wrestling business. He then tells Eric on television that he quit. Scott Hall thinks that it was unprofessional of Bret to do that on TV. Jim Cornette said that when the Montreal screwjob happened, he received death threat notes that he still keeps to this day. I don't know why he would want that, but okay. Bret felt so bad for Earl as he did not blame him for Vince's idea. Earl never talked to Bret for a while because he felt ashamed. They eventually talked a couple years later. Interviewers for this episode are Bret Hart, Eric Bischoff, Jim Cornette, Bruce Pritchard, Scott Hall, Earl Hebner, the referee, Harry Zaffrini, sound recordist, and Vince Russo. Thoughts about this episode is that I think Vince screwed himself and Bret. Although Bret has an ego and sounded a bit aggressive in this episode, I understand why he would feel this way because he seemed to really love the WWF and put a lot of his heart in it. Get it? Heart? Growing up in a wrestling family, he probably thinks of wrestling as a reminder of his family. I don't know, I could be wrong about that though. However, 2 years after the infamous Montreal screwjob, his brother Owen died in a pay-per-view at Over the Edge in 1999, and Vince still continued the event even though Owen had perished minutes later. I do agree on some things Vince and the writing team wanted, such as Bret forfeiting the title and just walking freely, but Bret did not want to. However, I do agree that Shawn was not a good candidate for the title as he was a jerk in the 90s. As heard by a lot of people, it was basically a lose-lose situation and no one got what they wanted other than Bret leaving WWF after being backstabbed by Vince. As for Vince, I don't think that was the first time he lied to a talent, as he currently has a lot of allegations right now. Bret got inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame a couple years later, and he and Vince patched things up. Until 2024 of this year, when a woman named Janelle alleged that Vince trafficked her and treated her like a sex toy. Bret stated that he cut Vince slack a long time ago, but after hearing these allegations, he has lost any respect he had for Vince. I thought it was funny how Jim Cornette said that he would urinate on Vince Russo's grave once he passed away. You could tell that Cornette and Russo despised each other. I give this episode a 9 out of 10, as I feel like the Russo and Cornette hating each other part was a little unnecessary. It was funny though. I do feel bad for Bret as he gave Vince another chance even after the screwjob and losing his brother. Losing a family member is unforgivable, and for Bret to forgive Vince was a nice act for Bret until the allegations came out this year. It's crazy how much has changed after this episode aired a couple years ago. I think maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, and that Vince ended up facing his karma and being let go of WWE eventually. If you want to know more information about the allegations, I would highly recommend watching my video on thoughts and observations on Vince McMahon allegations. You could check on my video library in my bio if you want to. But anyway, this is Dalster, and I'll see you guys in the next episode review or the next video. Take care of yourself and everyone around you, and I'll do the same. Bye, guys.